Recapping Dissection 11 from September 19th's gross lab. So the first thing we talked about in this lab were the boundaries of our abdominal cavity. And so our cranial boundary was our diaphragm, which we know attaches at the 3rd to 4th lumbar vertebrae, extends cranially to the 6th or 7th rib, attaches ventrally at the xiphoid process, and then runs around our costal arch. Our ventral and lateral boundaries will be based on our 4 abdominal wall muscles. They are just the muscles that wrap around our abdominal cavity, both laterally and ventrally. Our caudal boundary is our pelvic inlet. It is the entrance into our pelvic cavity. And finally, our dorsal boundary will be some thoracic vertebrae and then a whole bunch of lumbar vertebrae. As far as those vertebrae are concerned, some main differences that we are responsible for are, first of all, the spinous process. The spinous process is much longer and thinner in thoracic vertebrae than lumbar. The lumbar has a much wider and kind of shorter, dumpier spinous process. Also, the transverse process of the lumbar is much longer. It's kind of wing-shaped. It sticks out very noticeably, whereas the thoracic vertebrae's transverse process is much shorter and much less noticeable. Finally, the thoracic vertebrae's body on its ventral lateral side has the costal foeva, which are where the ribs can articulate. They're where the ribs stick in and move around. So, as far as our 4 main abdominal wall muscles go, we have the external abdominal oblique, the internal abdominal oblique, the transversus abdominis, and the rectus abdominis. Now, I'm going to start by drawing the rectus abdominis and talk about its attachments. So, the rectus abdominis is going to run lateral to our midline, our linea alba. And so it's going to attach at our xiphoid process and run cranioventrally to the land of the pelvis and attach at your prepubic tendon. Okay, now one important thing to notice that makes the rectus abdominis different from our other abdominal wall muscles is that it is not directly attached to that linea alba. The external abdominal oblique, the internal abdominal oblique, and the transversus abdominis all have aponeuroses that attach to that linea alba. But those aponeuroses kind of run over the rectus abdominis and form a sheath. And so there's no direct attachment between the rectus abdominis and the linea alba. Rather, the aponeuroses of the other abdominal wall muscles kind of hold it in place relative to that linea alba. So let's talk about the deepest muscle first, the transversus abdominis. The transversus abdominis is going to attach at lumbar vertebrae's transverse processes and run transversely, so in this direction, and attach at the linea alba via aponeurosis. Now, the transversus abdominis extends cranially into the first couple of ribs. I believe it attaches medially to them. And so you'll have them on both sides, extending into the last few ribs, and then attaching to the linea alba via aponeurosis. Now, one thing you'll notice is the transversus abdominis doesn't extend, the muscle part does not extend fully to the ventral aspect of your abdomen. You'll see that it kind of cuts off about halfway between the flank and the abdomen. I wouldn't stress too much about the boundaries. It's pretty obvious if you see the layers where it goes to, but ultimately it's I would say of the 3 muscles that we have left to talk about, this one is the one that doesn't extend the fullest. The other 2 can extend much further, especially the external abdominal oblique, which depending on the musculature of your animal, can go pretty much up to the boundary of the rectus abdominis. So next up we have our internal abdominal oblique. The internal abdominal oblique runs in a cranioventral direction, meaning the muscle fibers will run in this direction like so. Its attachments will be to the linea alba via aponeurosis for its medial attachment. Its lateral attachments will be a combination of the thoracolumbar fascia of the last few ribs, as well as some transverse processes of lumbar vertebrae. And again, it runs in a cranioventral direction. Now, like I said before, it attaches to the linea alba via aponeurosis. Now, the key difference between the transversus abdominis and the internal and external abdominal obliques aponeuroses is that the transversus abdominis, its aponeurosis runs deep to the rectus abdominis. So here I have another example. We said that transversus abdominis was green. You can see this black line, which I'm drawing, is representative of the aponeurosis, and it runs under or deep to that rectus abdominis. And this is going to form part of the rectus sheath, the connective tissue that covers the rectus abdominis and holds it in place relative to the midline. And that is, the name for that is the internal lamina of rectus sheath. So we've drawn our internal abdominal oblique. Now let's talk about the external. And so meanwhile, the internal abdominal oblique aponeurosis runs superficial to that rectus abdominis. So here you can see it kind of extends ventrally and covers the ventral part of that rectus, forming the external lamina of the rectus sheath. Finally, we have our external abdominal oblique, and that's going to run in a caudo-ventral direction. So it'll go like this. Okay? Now, where are its attachments? It attaches quite cranially. We remember seeing the external abdominal oblique back when we were in the land of the thorax. It extends all the way cranially to the 4th or 5th rib and attaches there, like the internal abdominal oblique, by an thoracolumbar fascia. Okay, so just connective tissue. Holds it onto the rib. And it will extend caudally to attach at prepubic tendon, much like the rectus abdominis does. Finally, it will attach again to our linea alba via aponeurosis. Okay? So that's the third of our three aponeurosising muscles. Okay? And again, if we look over here, we can see that the aponeurosis of the internal abdominal oblique meets with the external abdominal oblique's aponeurosis and forms that external sheath to our rectus abdominis. It extends to the external. It's the superficial sheath that covers the rectus abdominis and holds it still relative to the midline. Now let's look at this cross-section a bit more specifically and think about surgical approaches. Now, before we do that, let's orient ourselves. The superficial black line is our epidermis. The brown line is our dermis. Orange is subcutaneous connective tissue. Red is external abdominal oblique. Blue is internal abdominal oblique. And transversus abdominis is the green. This dotted green line underneath everything is going to be our parietal peritoneum, which is the serous membrane that separates these muscles from the actual abdominal cavity. And purple will be our rectus abdominis. Finally, the black lines, as I mentioned before, are going to represent the aponeuroses and the deep connective tissue that forms the linea alba over here. Now, one extra thing that's worth pointing out before we actually do these surgical approaches is depending on how cranial or caudal you are, you're going to see some ligaments sticking off of this center spot. If you are cranial to the umbilicus, so essentially at the level between the belly button and your diaphragm, you're going to see this big wavy ligament made of both ligament and fat, and that is going to be your falciform ligament. And that is a developmental remnant of the umbilical vein, the blood vessel that brought placental blood that was oxygenated to the fetus. Comparatively, if we extend further caudal, so now we're caudal to the umbilicus and towards the pelvic, the pelvic inlet, we're going to see, instead of the falciform ligament, we're going to see kind of a smaller, much less appreciable, but still there ligament, and that is our medial ligament to the bladder. And that is also a developmental remnant of the umbilical artery this time, the blood vessel that carries deoxygenated blood from the fetus back to the placenta to be oxygenated by the mother's cardiovascular system. That said, let's ignore these ligaments and just focus on the main surgical approach idea here. So let's say we go for a very midline approach, straight through the linea alba. This is very commonly used in surgical approaches in general because there is no muscle that you will cut if you go straight through that linea alba. Because let's look at our layers. We go through skin, so epidermis, followed by dermis and subcutaneous connective tissue, and then we hit the linea alba, which is just the amalgamation of the three aponeuroses of the external abdominal oblique and internal abdominal oblique, as well as the transversus abdominis. So there is no muscle you hit. So if you're going straight through the linea alba, it's epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous connective tissue, combined aponeuroses of abdominal wall muscles, and then parietal peritoneum, and then you're in your cavity. If we move over about a centimeter or two to the left or right, now we're at the level of the rectus abdominis, and now we're going to hit muscle, but only one, because everything else is just going to be aponeurosis. So, if we went here, it would be epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous connective tissue, external lamina of the rectus sheath, which we said is made from the combined aponeuroses of our external abdominal oblique and internal abdominal oblique. One level deeper is our rectus abdominis. One level beyond that is the aponeurosis of the transversus abdominis. And then we'll hit parietal peritoneum, and we're in the cavity. Finally, let's say if we go for a more lateral approach, we're going through the flank over here. Now we're going to hit every muscle. So we'd go epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous connective tissue, external abdominal oblique, internal abdominal oblique, transversus abdominis, and finally parietal peritoneum to get into the body wall, or into the abdominal cavity. This is much less used for like general approaches, but you'll see this a lot in large animal surgeries where they have to get access to the intestines, or more so the stomach, I think. But anyway, I digress. Those are the main takeaways from this day's lab, as far as I can think.